We have a few very interesting and important speakers lined up to talk about the issues right now, and we are going to continue booking more throughout the day. So please stay tuned, those of you who are dialing in from remotely, and those of you at the table, of course, and we will keep you posted as we grow to know what's going on as well. I do want to say thank you very much to Berkman and Co, which is the law office that's currently hosting us, that have been partners with JPC throughout the war, and is available here for events when we need them. The decision to have an event here today in Tel Aviv instead of Jerusalem obviously comes from the fact that the news cycle has very much moved to here because of the Hostages Square and the Defense Ministry. So we will likely continue doing more events in this area. At the moment, we have three speakers lined up over the next couple of hours to address different issues of the news, which of course is ongoing. And we're all very closely following the news cycle, trying to understand what's happening. Each of them will provide their own insight and opinions over the current events, whether it's from a security aspect, geopolitical, social, political, or the health of the hostages. And so really everyone is bringing their own world, and we are very, very eager to share that with you. Specifically, I'll say that the last time we held a briefing here was with a number of hostage families, including the Ziadne family, which at the time had 4 members of their family in Gaza. 2 of them were returned in the first deal in November, and unfortunately, the father and son, Yusuf and Hamad, were unfortunately killed in the last few weeks, and their bodies returned. Just a bit of housekeeping. This conversation is on the record. We're going to try to keep it for 15 minutes per speaker, followed by 5 minutes of Q&A, and then 10 minutes of one-on-ones to whoever is in the building, so that we can allow for time for everybody. And those one-on-ones, please make sure that you go through Esty, who is not in the room right now, but she'll be back, just so there's a bit of order. I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is graciously joining us really from the last second, Dr. Einat Wilf. She's a leading thinker in Israel on Israel and Zionism, foreign policy and education. She was a member of Knesset, Israel's parliament, from 2010 to 2013, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Dr. Wilf was a foreign policy advisor to the late, at the time, Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who of course was our president as well, and was a strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. She has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge, and was the Goldman visiting professor at Georgetown University. Dr. Wilf is the author of 7 books that explore key issues in Israeli society, and has been very vocal over the past few years in Israeli-Palestinian issues, being interviewed, of course, on many platforms across the world, and we're very appreciative of her time. And today she will address, her own thoughts on the deal in terms of its social, political, and geopolitical impact. So with that said, Dr. Wilf, I'll turn the mic over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. You're probably hearing it from everyone, not just me. Israel now has been thrown into a maelstrom of contradictory emotions. On the one hand, a sense of relief, joy, hope. On the other hand, a deep sense of fear, foreboding, fury, anger. I think the reason that the emotions are so contradictory is that first of all, we don't yet know what's going to happen. We don't know how many we're getting, how many of them are alive. Are we going to get all of them back? There is deep fear that the way that this deal has been construed is one that actually creates a horrific selection between some who will be returned and some who will remain as bargaining chips forever. So there is that fear about what we're really getting. There is the question, of course, of the price. Fresh in everyone's mind is the connection between the release of the 1,027 murderers in the Shalit deal, and the fact that one of them, Sinwar, was the mastermind behind October 7th. And so many of us felt a sense of relief and joy over the Shalit deal. And we know how that ended. So again, there's a fear of being stuck in a kind of repetitive loop. And that, I think, is also part of the fear and the foreboding. A question that Israelis ask themselves: can we be sure that what was will not be again? So again, if we go back to the Shalit deal, some people will say, well, it wasn't just about Sinwar being released. It's about our inaction in all the years after that, the Qatari cash, UNRWA, essentially closing our eyes to what the Palestinians were building in Gaza at our doorstep. And the fact that we were blind to it, even enabled it, thinking that we could bribe them out of their annihilationist ideology. So only to discover that they were, as they have been for the last century, deeply committed to it. So Israelis are asking themselves, will we be different? Will we be more vigilant this time? Because are we getting out of Gaza, and how can we ensure that they, to use the Biden, that they will build back better, that they will just rebuild more and more and be even more effective the next time around. And I think also there's a deep sense of betrayal by the way that the international community in general and the United States in particular has handled the situation. And here I will say that I think a lot of Israelis are horrified that what was normalized fairly quickly in the first days after October 7th is that people can invade a country, butcher and massacre its citizens, kidnap them, and then the world will expect the invaded country to negotiate. The fact that we normalized that this is a negotiating situation, the fact that we treated Qatar as some benevolent mediator rather than the vile country that it is, and the force that has unfortunately successfully spent every day 24/7 since October 7th protecting Hamas, ensuring that it will never be weakened, that it will never have to pay a price. And it's important to say, from the perspective of Hamas, they did not pay a price for October 7th. And I know this sounds odd because we look at it from the Western perspective of the destruction in Gaza, of the people killed. But from their perspective, they did not pay the only price that mattered to them. They will say, we showed that it's possible to invade Israel, to butcher its citizens, to kidnap them, and we remain standing and in control. And that's the only thing that matters to them. Qatar has been working 24/7, ensuring that that's what they will achieve, unfortunately, successfully. The hostages have been the insurance for that. And the fact that the Western world and the leaders of the free world did not stand up on the first day after October 7th to say to Hamas, Israel owes you nothing. We will not negotiate with you. A few months ago, there was this article in The Atlantic detailing the first 10 months after October 7th. They talked about a telephone call from Qatar to Secretary Blinken that Qatar wants to help negotiate. And I remember thinking, how did Secretary Blinken did not just say, there's no negotiations, tell your people, tell Hamas, basically your assets in Gaza, to release the hostages, or all hell will break loose. Where is that America? Where are those leaders? The fact that people normalized a negotiating situation, the fact that international organizations like the Red Cross never essentially stood up to say unacceptable, we demand to see them. The fact that Israel was expected to constantly supply its enemy as it was holding its hostages. We have normalized in the last year and 3 months so many terrible things that ultimately we're at this point where there is no choice. And I think that's why you're saying this maelstrom of emotions, the relief of seeing the hostages, again, remains to be seen, the hope and joy that we'll see them. But again, we'll see who really comes back, who's alive, but also fury and a sense of betrayal and fear and foreboding for what all this means.
Okay, so we'll go into a few pre-submitted questions. Thank you, Dr. Wilf. We'll go into some pre-submitted questions before opening up the floor. So really, you've given a kind of explanation about how Israelis are now feeling towards their allies, towards the rest of the world. Could you bring it in a bit and maybe address how the cleavages within Israeli society, which obviously are divided kind of into pre-October 7th and post-October 7th, might look the day after, given the fact that there's so much, there's so much disagreement about what should have happened since the war and whether or not this deal should have taken place to begin with?
So my perspective here that in many ways, if October 7th was not a massive blow to the idea of the Israeli right, and especially as headed by Netanyahu, then the last 15 months certainly are. Because if what the so-called right-wing government, headed by supposedly a tough prime minister, if all they've been able to achieve is to ultimately give in to all of Hamas's demands, then the opposition at least can say, we at least wanted to give in to their demands sooner. But the question here, where is the leadership, competent leadership, that would say, where is the Ben Gurion that knew to stand up for the rights of the Jewish people? Because ultimately, if the only choice for Israelis is between who will give in to our enemies sooner, we begin to question whether the people of Israel, who have really shown themselves willing to fight and sacrifice, right? Before October 7th, everyone thought that we've grown comfortable, we've grown not willing anymore to sacrifice for the idea of a sovereign Jewish state. And by the way, I think this is what Sinwar thought when Assad and his army fell so quickly. I thought that this is perhaps what Sinwar thought when he saw Israeli society being torn. I think he really thought that Israelis fight for their leader. Maybe that's the world that he comes from. And I think he really thought that at a critical moment, Israelis will behave like the Syrian army, refusing to fight for their leader. And again, he made the same mistake that Arabs have made for the last century, not understanding why we fight. We do not fight for this or that leader. We fight for the right of the Jewish people to finally be masters of their fate in their sovereign land. It has only ever been our one non-negotiable. Unfortunately, this is also the one Palestinian non-negotiable. They want the Jewish state not to exist. But I think within Israel, perhaps we'll begin a search to see that these people who really were willing to fight and sacrifice, can they have leaders who do not offer them a choice between surrendering now and surrendering a bit later?
Okay, one journalist is asking from from the Zoom. Going back to the geopolitical context, if you think that Israel could have avoided sending humanitarian aid or allowing the entrance of humanitarian aid without becoming even more of a pariah than it already has been, given the actions at the ICC, at the ICJ, is this even feasible to do during the war?
The first, a matter of language. It's not humanitarian aid. It is a resupply to the enemy at a time of war. And I think, first of all, the short answer is yes, absolutely. Not only do I think we could have done it, I think if it would have been the one thing we insisted on from the beginning, the war would have been shorter and with much, much, much less suffering. I think this is the one thing that an Israeli leader should have stood for on the first day, to basically say, we're sorry, we made a mistake. We thought that on the other side of this line live a people who want to care for their own, rather than subject all the money, aid, and capabilities that they have to the goal of no Jewish state. So we're done. We are no longer supplying them. We exited in 2005 in order to allow them to build. What they've built is the most weaponized landscape for the singular purpose of our destruction. So we're not supplying that. And from our borders, the borders that were breached and invaded, we're not supplying our enemy. Egypt, which clearly has been supplying our enemy, is welcome to do so. But we are not doing that. We are the people that they invaded, that they attacked. We are not supplying our enemy. And this also goes to the first and biggest mistake that was done, which is defining the enemy badly. I compare this saying that the war is against Hamas to Americans declaring in December 1941 that they're going to fight against Japanese pilots. Our war is with Palestinianism, the obsessive ideology that unfortunately unites a people, not around a constructive vision of building for themselves, but around the destructive vision of destroying what the Jews have built. Hamas is merely the executive arm of Palestinianism. It is the Japanese pilots. But the imperial racial supremacist ideology is that of a people. And Palestinianism as an ideology, not the people, but the ideology has to die. And once we've made it clear that, and we basically told a lie that the enemy is only Hamas. Once you agree to tell a lie, everything you build on the lie comes crooked. So you start by defining the enemy correctly. The enemy is Palestinianism, the obsessive ideology that seeks nothing else but the destruction of what the Jews have built. And to that end, it subjects everything. That ideology has to die. When the ideology dies, we're happy to live next to a people who no longer seek our annihilation, but not before. And we will certainly not supply them. And I think if we had leaders who stood firm on the first day and said quite simply, from our side, nothing goes in until the hostages come out, repeat that every day, every hour, and be firm on it. And if the US says, well, we'll not supply you with more bombs, as far as I'm concerned, don't bomb anyone, but just make it clear that from your side, you're not supplying the enemy. And certainly from your side, again, Egypt can supply the enemy if it wants to, but from our side, the side that was invaded, we're not supplying the enemy, and nothing goes in from our side until the hostages come in. I think this was the moral position to take. I think that kind of clarity would ultimately have pierced the way people think. I actually think that people felt comfortable, the ICC, the ICJ, precisely because we normalized so many crazy things. I feel that a lot of my work in the last 15 months was to tell people, this is not normal. This is crazy. It's not normal to negotiate, this is a negotiating situation. It's not normal. It's not normal to treat Qatar as, as a, like a lovely mediator. It's not normal to supply your enemy as it fights you. It's not normal. People used to know that.
Very, very clear. There are a few more questions that have come in remotely, but I want to make sure that the people who actually arrive physically are able to ask their questions first. Ricky from Voice of America, you have a question?
The world has forgotten about October 7th and sees Israel as the aggressor. Do you think that a deal will improve Israel's diplomatic position?
The way that the world, there's all kinds of worlds, but those who subscribe to what have come to call the placard strategy, because you see it in anti-Israel placards, which is the repetitive equation of Israel with all of the world's evils. Those who for the last few decades have kind of promoted the placard strategy, Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals racism, apartheid, Nazism, genocide. They never cared about what Israel did. They only ever cared about what Israel is. The only aggression, and I'm now kind of updating with Adi, the book, The War of Return, and we're going through the quotes of Israel's enemies over the decades. They're very clear that Israel's only aggression has only ever been daring to believe that the Jews can be sovereign in their ancestral homeland. That is the foundational aggression. So the fact that what Israel does, by now we have decades of empirical proof that the aggression is what Israel is, not what Israel does.
Yes, sorry, just introduce yourself, please.
Pia Steckerbach from German Public Radio ARD. Thank you very much, first of all, for doing this. I would be wondering how you assess the role of incoming President Donald Trump. Do you think that the negotiations would be at this point where they are right now without Donald Trump? How do you assess the pressure that is coming from the US currently?
Probably not. He made it very clear that he wants this to be over. Some people, I don't know, I have no insight into his mind. Some people say he wants his Reagan moment, right? When Reagan was inaugurated, the people that Iran had, the hostages were released. Some people say he wants the same split screen in his inauguration of hostages being released. So clearly that pressure and the declarations of, there'll be hell to pay if the hostages are not released. But I would say that in many ways, we got the worst of both worlds. What does it mean? We got the urgency of Trump with the weakness of Biden. And that in many ways has been the worst possible combination.
And we have a question here as well.
Yes, when you talk about the enemy is badly defined, and I wonder what is your perspective that how is this badly defining the enemy is affected or by the Netanyahu government because of his own political situation that perhaps is deliberately badly defining the enemy? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Not sure. I don't know.
I was wondering how is this defining the enemy incorrectly or badly is not, because we all know that Netanyahu is such a smart politician and quote unquote leader. How could he badly defining the enemy? How is it part of his strategy?
So
Political strategy because of his own political situation.
Here I will say my sense. It has nothing to do with a specific political situation. I've find him over the years. Sorry?
No, go ahead, go
Okay.
ahead.
I think he combined a terrible combination of weakness and do you have how do you say in English, zilzul?
Disrespect.
What?
Disrespect.
It's not really disrespect. It's like he wouldn't, I'll just do it as a big phrase. He never took the Palestinians seriously as an enemy. So this is, I think he created the wrong pyramid of putting Iran at the top and the Palestinians at the bottom. And our enemies have always been the Palestinians or the Mandate Arabs. They've had their supporters for the last centuries, the Nazis in the 30s and 40s, the Pan-Arabists, the Soviets, the Iranians. Now Turkey is angling to become the new sponsor of Palestinianism. But they have always been our forsworn enemies with a total ideology that has been dedicated to one thing and one thing only, which is no Jewish state. Now, Netanyahu knows that, but he just never took it seriously. And I think that is, again, a terrible combination. So when President Biden came here after October 7th and gave a beautiful speech about the evil that was unleashed on that day, he went on to say, but Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. And I remember listening to that in real time and thinking, oh, we're going to pay dearly for that sentiment. And again, this was a moment for another type of leader to stand up and say, thank you so much for everything that you're doing, President Biden. Unfortunately, Hamas does represent the Palestinians, and more deeply, the Palestinian ideology of no Jewish state. They are merely its executive arm, the most recent and brutal one, but no different from previous executive arms of Palestinianism. This is why you had so much euphoria on October 7th among Palestinians and their collaborators around the world. It was the euphoria of finally seeing the Palestinian vision of so-called return, this violent triumph being realized. And right now, all the evidence points to the fact that Hamas very much represents the Palestinians. We'd love to see evidence to the contrary, but we're not going to fight a war that is for our very existence based on a lie. But no, what he did was being weak and caved in and agreed to pretend that this is merely a war against Japanese pilots. And as a result, in many ways, that was the moment when everything else became impossible. You can't win a war against the enemy when you badly define the enemy.
We're actually out of time, so I want to make sure that if anybody in the room hasn't had a chance to ask a question, then now is that time. Anyone here want to ask the question? Okay, Dr. Einat Wilf, thank you so much for your time and really the your flexibility and of course your insight, which is the most important thing that we'd like to thank you for.
Thank you.